3 a.m. You're alone on a desolate stretch of interstate highway. Nothing but your headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The only sounds are the rumble of your 18-wheeler and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Then suddenly, something steps out of the tree line that shouldn't exist. Something massive. Something watching you with glowing eyes that reflect your headlights like mirrors. Tonight, I'm bringing you 10 absolutely terrifying real stories from America's truck drivers. Men and women who spend their nights navigating the country's most isolated highways, witnessing things that would make your blood run cold. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are first-hand accounts from professional drivers who've seen the impossible and lived to tell about it. From encounters with legendary creatures in the Pacific Northwest to ghostly hitchhikers on southern backroads, these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about what lurks in America's darkest corners. So turn off the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. But I'm warning you now, after hearing these stories, you might never look at a lonely highway the same way again. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the sun goes down and America's truck drivers are left alone with the night? Let's begin. Meet Jake Morrison, a veteran long-haul trucker with over 20 years of experience hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest. Jake thought he'd seen everything during his 2 decades on the road. Whether that could kill you, road rage incidents that turned deadly, and enough close calls to fill a horror movie. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared him for what happened on Highway 101 near the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. It was a cold October night in 2019. Jake was hauling a load of lumber from Port Angeles to Seattle, a route he'd driven hundreds of times before. The fog was thick that night, so dense that even his high beams could barely penetrate more than 50 feet ahead. He was taking his time, maintaining a steady 45 miles per hour, when something made him slow down even further. Have you ever had that feeling where every instinct in your body is screaming that something is wrong, even though you can't see or hear anything out of the ordinary? That's exactly what Jake experienced. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. That's when he saw the eyes. At first, Jake thought it might be a deer or elk standing near the roadside. Large animals were common in this area, and any experienced trucker knows to watch for them. But as he got closer, he realized these eyes were wrong. They were too high off the ground, too far apart, and they had an intelligence behind them that made his stomach drop. The fog began to clear for just a moment, and that's when Jake got the shock of his life. Standing at least 9 feet tall at the edge of the forest was a massive, hair-covered figure. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, broader than any human Jake had ever seen. Its arms hung down to its knees, and its face, oh God, its face, was a nightmarish combination of human and ape features that seemed to stare right into Jake's soul. But here's the part that still gives Jake nightmares to this day. The creature didn't run when it saw his truck approaching. It didn't dart back into the forest like any normal animal would. Instead, it took 3 deliberate steps toward the highway, directly into Jake's path. Jake slammed on his brakes, his trailer jackknifing slightly on the wet pavement. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the diesel engine. For what felt like an eternity, man and creature stared at each other through the windshield. The thing's eyes seemed to glow with their own light, and Jake swears he could see what looked like intelligence, maybe even curiosity, in that terrifying gaze. Then something even stranger happened. The creature raised one massive hand, not in a threatening gesture, but almost as if it was waving. Jake blinked, certain he was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. But when he opened his eyes, the gesture was unmistakable. This thing, this impossible creature, was acknowledging him. The encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but to Jake, it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, The creature turned and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Within moments, it had vanished completely into the treeline, leaving Jake alone with his racing heart and the impossible memory of what he'd just witnessed. Jake sat there for several minutes trying to process what had happened. Was he losing his mind? Had he been driving too long without sleep? But the skid marks on the pavement from his emergency braking were real. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was real. And deep down, he knew that what he'd seen was real too. He radioed ahead to other truckers on the highway, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what had happened. Most of the responses were jokes and laughter. A few drivers suggested he take a break and get some sleep. But one voice came through the static that made Jake's blood run even colder than it already was. An older driver named Bill, who'd been running Northwest routes for over 30 years, came on the radio with a deadly serious tone. Bill told Jake that he'd seen the same creature in that exact spot 3 years earlier, and that several other drivers had reported similar encounters over the years. The locals in the area had a name for it. They called it the Highway Guardian, and according to Bill, every driver who'd encountered it and lived to tell about it had later avoided a serious accident somewhere else on their route. Jake thought Bill was just trying to make him feel better, but 2 days later, something happened that changed his perspective forever. He was driving through a construction zone near Spokane when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the exact spot where Jake's sleeper cab would have been if he hadn't slowed down at the last second. The same inexplicable feeling that had made him slow down on Highway 101 had struck again, saving his life. To this day, Jake maintains that the creature he encountered that night was no ordinary animal. He believes it was something ancient, something that has been watching over the highways of the Pacific Northwest for longer than any of us can imagine. And while most people dismiss his story as the hallucination of an overtired driver, Jake knows what he saw. He knows that something impossible is out there, walking among the trees, occasionally stepping out to remind us that there are still mysteries in this world that we may never understand. But Jake's encounter was just the beginning. As word of his story spread through the trucking community, other drivers began coming forward with their own terrifying experiences. And what they revealed would challenge everything we think we know about the creatures that inhabit America's most remote highways. Sarah Chun had been driving big rigs for 8 years when she encountered something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. It was a humid August night in 2021, and she was hauling a load of electronics from Las Vegas to Washington, D.C., taking the loneliest highway in America, Route 50 through Nevada. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing. For hundreds of miles, there's nothing but desert, sagebrush, and the occasional abandoned gas station. Sarah was about 60 miles east of Austin, Nevada, when her CB radio started acting up. The static was getting worse, and she could hear what sounded like voices whispering in languages she didn't recognize. She'd been on the road long enough to know that atmospheric conditions could cause strange radio interference. But this was different. This sounded almost conversational, like people having a discussion just beyond the range of comprehension. She was trying to tune to a clearer channel when she saw him. Standing on the side of the road in the middle of absolute nowhere was a man in what looked like a 1940s military uniform. His thumb was out and he was clearly trying to hitchhike. Sarah's first thought was that this guy must be in some kind of serious trouble to be out here alone in the desert at 2 in the morning. Now, every trucker knows the golden rule about picking up hitchhikers. You don't do it, period. The liability issues alone are enough to get you fired, not to mention the safety concerns. But something about this situation felt different to Sarah. The guy looked young, maybe early 20s, and he seemed genuinely distressed. Against her better judgment, Sarah pulled over. As she brought the truck to a stop, she got a better look at the hitchhiker through her side mirror. His uniform was perfectly pressed, like he'd just put it on. His hair was slicked back in that classic 1940s style, and he was carrying what looked like a military-issue duffel bag. But here's where things started to get really strange. When Sarah rolled down her window to talk to him, she noticed that despite being in the middle of the Nevada desert in August, she couldn't see her breath, but she could see his. Clouds of vapor were coming from his mouth with every word he spoke, as if he was standing in freezing cold air. The young soldier approached her window and said, in a voice that seemed to come from far away, "Ma'am, I sure would appreciate a ride. I'm trying to get home to my girl in Missouri. Been away for 3 years, and she's waiting for me." Sarah's heart went out to him. She'd heard stories about soldiers coming home from deployment, disoriented and in need of help. She made the decision that would change her life forever. She told him to climb in. As he walked around to the passenger side of the cab, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The young man wasn't casting a shadow, despite the bright headlights of her truck illuminating the ground around him. She blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light, but when she looked again, the absence of a shadow was unmistakable. The soldier climbed into the passenger seat, and immediately the temperature inside the cab plummeted. Sarah's breath became visible, and she could feel goosebumps forming on her arms. The soldier smiled at her, a sad, distant smile, and said, "Thank you kindly, ma'am. You don't know how long I've been waiting for someone to stop." Sarah put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, trying to make small talk to ease her growing discomfort. She asked him about his service, where he was stationed, how long he'd been trying to get home. His answers were vague but consistent. He'd been overseas, somewhere in the Pacific, and he'd been traveling for what felt like forever. About 30 minutes into the ride, Sarah happened to glance at her passenger and nearly drove off the road. The soldier was becoming transparent. She could see the truck's interior through his body, as if he was slowly fading away like a photograph left in the sun. Sarah pulled over immediately, her hands shaking as she brought the truck to a stop. She turned to face her passenger fully, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears. The young soldier was looking at her with eyes that held a depth of sadness she'd never encountered before. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice now barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I just wanted to go home so badly. But I've been trying to get home for so long now. I think I've forgotten that I can't." Sarah wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand what was happening, but her voice caught in her throat. The soldier continued, "I died in the Pacific in 1943. My ship was torpedoed, and I went down with 700 of my brothers. But I never made it home to see Mary, my fiancée. Never got to keep my promise." As he spoke, images began flashing in Sarah's mind like someone was projecting a movie directly into her brain. She saw a young woman in a 1940s dress, standing on a train platform holding a letter. She saw a naval battle, explosions lighting up the night sky, and young men disappearing beneath dark waves. She saw years passing, the young woman growing older, eventually marrying someone else, having children, living a life that moved on without the soldier who never came home. "Mary passed away in 1987, the soldier said, his form now so translucent that Sarah could barely see him. "I felt it when she died, like someone cutting a rope I'd been hanging onto. That's when I knew I was never going home. That's when I understood that I was already dead." Sarah finally found her voice. "Why are you here? On this highway?" The soldier smiled sadly. "I don't rightly know. I just keep finding myself here, hoping someone will give me a ride home. Maybe I'm looking for other lost souls, or maybe I'm just too stubborn to accept that some journeys end before we reach our destination." With those words, the soldier faded completely from view, leaving only the lingering scent of Old Spice cologne and the gradually warming cab. Sarah sat there for a long time, staring at the empty passenger seat, trying to process what had just happened. When she finally got back on the road, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the passenger seat was a small, black and white photograph of a young couple. The man was clearly the soldier she'd just given a ride to, and the woman, beautiful and smiling, had Mary 1942 written on the back in faded ink. Sarah kept that photograph, and to this day, she carries it with her on every trip. She's never encountered the phantom hitchhiker again, but other drivers have reported picking up a similar figure on the same stretch of Route 50. They all describe the same thing: a polite young soldier trying to get home who vanishes during the ride, leaving behind only questions and the profound sadness of a promise that could never be kept. But the desert highways of America hold more than just lonely spirits. Sometimes the things that appear in a trucker's headlights are far more sinister and far more dangerous. Tommy Yazzie grew up on the Navajo Nation reservation in Arizona, and he knew the old stories. His grandmother had told him about the creatures that could take the shape of animals or even people, beings that existed in the space between the physical and spirit worlds. But Tommy thought those were just stories, legends meant to keep children from wandering too far from home at night. He never imagined he'd encounter one of these creatures during a routine freight run through his ancestral lands. It was November 2020, and Tommy was hauling a load of construction materials from Phoenix to Flagstaff, taking Highway 17 north through some of the most remote desert country in Arizona. He'd made this run hundreds of times, but this particular night felt different from the moment he left Phoenix. The desert seemed unusually quiet, and even the coyotes, which normally filled the night with their calls, were silent. Tommy was about 20 miles south of Camp Verde when he first noticed the dog. It was running alongside his truck, easily keeping pace despite the fact that he was doing 65 miles per hour. At first, he thought it might be a coyote, but as he got a better look, he realized this animal was much larger, more like a wolf or a very large German shepherd. What struck Tommy as odd was how effortlessly the animal was keeping up with his truck. He'd seen plenty of dogs and coyotes over the years, and none of them could maintain a sustained run at highway speeds. This creature was loping along as if 65 miles per hour was a leisurely jog. Tommy slowed down, thinking the animal would fall behind, but instead, it adjusted its pace to match his truck's speed. When he sped up, it sped up. When he slowed down, it slowed down. It was almost as if the creature was playing some kind of game with him. That's when Tommy noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The animal was running on its hind legs, not like a dog standing up to beg for treats. This creature was running upright with a fluid, almost human gait. Its front legs were swinging at its sides like arms, and its head was held high, looking directly at Tommy through the cab window. Tommy had heard enough stories from his grandmother to know exactly what he was looking at. This was a skinwalker, a shape-shifting creature from Navajo legend that could take the form of any animal it chose. These beings were said to be witches or medicine men who had turned to dark magic, gaining the power to transform but losing their humanity in the process. The creature ran alongside Tommy's truck for nearly 5 miles, never tiring, never falling behind. Occasionally, it would turn its head to look at him, and Tommy could see intelligence in its eyes, a malevolent awareness that sent chills down his spine. This wasn't just an animal. This was something that knew exactly what it was doing. Then, without warning, the creature did something that nearly caused Tommy to lose control of his truck. It spoke. The voice came through the CB radio, clear as day, speaking in perfect English with no static or interference. "Tommy Yazzie," the voice said, "son of Robert Yazzie, grandson of Mary Begay. I know you, boy. I know your family. I know your blood." Tommy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. How could this creature know his name, know his family? He tried to respond on the radio, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The voice continued, "Your grandmother told you about us, didn't she? She told you the old stories, but she didn't tell you everything. She didn't tell you that we can follow you home, that we never forget a scent, never forget a face." Tommy looked out his window, and the creature was still there, still running alongside his truck. But now it was smiling, showing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous for any natural animal. "Pull over, Tommy," the voice said through the radio. "Let me tell you a better story. Let me show you what your grandmother never dared to teach you." Tommy did the only thing he could think of. He floored the accelerator, pushing his truck to nearly 80 miles per hour. For a moment, he thought he'd left the creature behind. He looked in his mirrors and saw nothing but empty highway and darkness. But then the voice came through the radio again, and it was laughing. "You can't outrun what you are, Tommy. You can't outrun your blood." Tommy looked out his passenger window, and there was the creature, now running on the opposite side of the truck. It had somehow crossed 4 lanes of highway without him seeing it move. The impossibility of it made Tommy's mind reel. That's when the creature did something even more terrifying. It began to change. The transformation happened slowly, like watching a time-lapse film in reverse. The creature's fur began to recede, revealing pale, almost translucent skin underneath. Its limbs elongated, becoming more human-like, and its face began to shift and reshape itself. Within minutes, what had been a wolf-like creature was now something that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that Tommy couldn't fully articulate. The proportions were off, the movements too fluid, and the eyes retained that predatory intelligence that no human should possess. "Do you see now, Tommy?" the voice asked. "Do you understand what we are? We are possibility. We are what your people could become if they weren't so afraid of power." The thing that was no longer entirely animal reached out toward Tommy's truck, and its fingers seemed to stretch impossibly far, nearly touching his window. Tommy could see that its fingernails had grown into claws, and there were symbols carved into its palms, symbols that seemed to shift and move in the darkness. Tommy began to pray in Navajo, reciting protection chants his grandmother had taught him as a child. The moment he started praying, the creature recoiled as if it had been burned. "Your grandmother's magic," it hissed through the radio. "Always hiding behind the old woman's skirts, Tommy. Always choosing the easy path." But something in the creature's voice had changed. It sounded weaker, more distant. Tommy continued praying, his voice growing stronger as he remembered more of the protective words his grandmother had made him memorize. The creature began to fall behind, its form becoming less distinct. "This isn't over, Tommy Yazzie," it called out, its voice now barely audible through the static. "We know where you live. We know where your family sleeps. We'll be waiting when you come home." Tommy drove for another hour before he felt safe enough to stop. When he finally pulled into a truck stop near Flagstaff, he called his grandmother immediately. She listened to his story without interruption, and when he finished, there was a long silence on the phone. "Tommy," she finally said, "you need to come home. There are things we need to discuss, ceremonies that need to be performed. You've been marked now, and that's not something that goes away on its own." Tommy completed his delivery and drove straight home to the reservation. His grandmother performed a cleansing ceremony that lasted 3 days, burning sage and cedar, singing the old songs, and marking protective symbols around Tommy's house. But even now, more than 3 years later, Tommy still sees things in his peripheral vision when he drives through the desert at night. Shapes that move just beyond the reach of his headlights, shadows that seem to follow his truck along the roadside. And sometimes, late at night when the CB radio is quiet, he swears he can still hear that voice calling his name through the static. The desert remembers everything Tommy learned, And some things, once awakened, never go back to sleep. Marcus Williams had been driving trucks for 15 years, hauling freight up and down the eastern seaboard, but he'd never experienced anything like what happened to him on Interstate 64 in Virginia. It was a cold February night in 2022, and Marcus was making a delivery run from Norfolk to Richmond, carrying a load of automotive parts that needed to be delivered first thing in the morning. The route took him through some of the most isolated stretches of highway in Virginia, winding through forests and marshlands where cell phone service was spotty at best. Marcus had driven this route dozens of times before, but on this particular night, something felt fundamentally wrong from the moment he left Norfolk. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus approached the bridge over the Chickahominy River. This bridge had always given him an uneasy feeling, though he'd never been able to explain why. It was just a standard highway bridge, maybe a quarter-mile long, spanning the dark water below. But every time he crossed it, Marcus felt like he was being watched by unseen eyes. Tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. As he approached the bridge, Marcus noticed that his truck's engine was running rougher than usual. The diesel motor, which had been purring smoothly just moments before, was now sputtering and coughing like it was running on bad fuel. But it wasn't until he was halfway across the bridge that Marcus heard the screaming. It started as a low wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, Marcus thought it might be wind blowing through the bridge's support structures, but as the sound grew louder, it became unmistakably human. Someone was screaming in absolute terror, and the sound was coming from directly below the bridge. Marcus pulled over to the shoulder, his truck's hazard lights flashing in the darkness. He rolled down his window and listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the screaming. The sound was heartbreaking, a desperate cry for help that seemed to echo up from the black water below. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of his truck. He jogged to the bridge's guardrail and shined his light down toward the river. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the murky water about 60 feet below. But there was no one there. No boat in distress, no swimmer in trouble. The river was completely empty. Yet the screaming continued, seeming to surround Marcus now that he was outside his truck. The sound was so loud and so close that he instinctively looked over his shoulder, expecting to see someone standing right behind him. But the bridge was deserted except for his own truck. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his skin crawl. The screaming wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like someone trying to form words. He listened more carefully, and gradually, he began to make out what sounded like, "Help me. Please help me. Don't leave me here." Marcus called out into the darkness. "Where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you." His voice echoed off the bridge supports, but the only response was more screaming, now with an even more desperate quality. He was about to call 911 when he noticed something moving in the water below. At first, it looked like debris floating downstream, but as he focused his flashlight on it, Marcus realized he was looking at what appeared to be a human figure. It was floating face down, arms outstretched, drifting slowly with the current. Marcus immediately dialed 911, reporting a possible drowning victim. While he waited for emergency services to arrive, he kept his flashlight trained on the figure in the water. But the longer he watched, the more convinced he became that something was very wrong with what he was seeing. The figure in the water wasn't behaving like a drowning victim or a body. It was moving against the current, circling back under the bridge in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. And every time it passed directly beneath Marcus, the screaming would get louder. When the state police arrived 20 minutes later, Marcus led them to the spot where he'd seen the figure. But when they shined their high-powered lights down at the water, there was nothing there. The river was empty, flowing peacefully toward the Chesapeake Bay. The police were professional but skeptical. They took Marcus's statement and radioed for a search and rescue boat to check the area downstream. But Marcus could tell they thought he was either mistaken or possibly under the influence of something. That's when one of the older officers, a sergeant named Hayes who'd been working this area for over 20 years, pulled Marcus aside. "Son," he said quietly, "you're not the first person to report hearing screaming from this bridge. We get calls about it maybe 4 or 5 times a year." Officer Hayes went on to explain that the bridge had a dark history. In 1987, a young woman named Rebecca Morrison had driven her car off this very bridge during a severe thunderstorm. Her body was never recovered, despite extensive search efforts. Some people believed she'd survived the crash and drowned trying to swim to shore. Others thought the current had carried her body downstream, where it remained hidden in the muddy bottom of the river. "The thing is," Officer Hayes continued, "the reports we get all describe the same thing, a woman screaming for help from the water below the bridge. But we've never found any evidence that anyone was actually in distress. No abandoned cars, no missing persons reports, nothing." Marcus asked if anyone had ever tried to investigate the bridge itself, maybe look into its history more thoroughly. Officer Hayes nodded grimly. "We had a paranormal investigation team out here about 5 years ago. They recorded some interesting audio, but nothing conclusive. The one thing they all agreed on was that this bridge has what they called residual energy. According to them, traumatic events can sometimes leave an imprint on a location, causing them to replay over and over again." As the police wrapped up their investigation, Marcus climbed back into his truck, shaken but determined to complete his delivery. But as he started his engine and prepared to leave, he heard the screaming one more time. This time, it seemed to come from right beside his truck, as if someone was standing just outside his passenger door. Marcus looked out the window, but saw nothing but darkness and the empty bridge stretching ahead of him. He put the truck in gear and drove across the bridge as quickly as he could, not slowing down until he was miles away. But the experience haunted Marcus for weeks afterward. He found himself taking alternate routes to avoid the bridge, even though it added an hour to his delivery times. When he did have to cross it, usually during daylight hours, he would roll up his windows and turn his radio up loud, trying to drown out any sounds that might be coming from the water below. Other truckers in the area shared similar stories when Marcus began asking around. The bridge over the Chickahominy River had developed a reputation in the trucking community as a place to avoid after dark. Drivers reported everything from phantom screaming to seeing lights moving under the water to experiencing sudden, inexplicable mechanical problems while crossing the bridge. Some drivers claimed that if you crossed the bridge at exactly midnight, you could see the ghostly outline of a submerged car in the water below, its headlights still glowing after all the years. Others said that the spirit of Rebecca Morrison was still trying to flag down passing drivers, hoping someone would finally stop to help her climb out of the river that had become her watery grave. Marcus never saw the phantom car or the ghostly figure, but he never forgot the sound of that desperate screaming. And on quiet nights, when he's driving through similar remote areas, he sometimes thinks he can still hear it carried on the wind, a reminder that some cries for help echo long after anyone is left to answer them. Elena Rodriguez thought she'd seen every type of dangerous situation a trucker could encounter during her 12 years on the road. Road rage incidents, drunk drivers, severe weather, and equipment failures were all part of the job. But nothing in her experience prepared her for the 3-hour nightmare that began on a lonely stretch of Highway 285 in West Texas during the summer of 2021. Elena was hauling a load of oil field equipment from Houston to Midland, a route that took her through some of the most desolate country in America. Miles of desert scrubland, punctuated by the occasional oil derrick or abandoned farmhouse. It was the kind of drive where you could go 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle. She was about 50 miles southeast of Pecos when she first noticed the pickup truck in her mirrors. It was an older model, maybe early 2000s, painted in a faded red color that looked almost brown in the desert sun. The truck was maintaining a steady distance behind her, close enough to be clearly visible but far enough back to avoid looking suspicious. At first, Elena didn't think much of it. Plenty of vehicles ended up following trucks for miles on these long, straight highways, especially when there weren't many opportunities to pass safely. But after 30 minutes, the pickup was still there, maintaining exactly the same distance. Elena decided to test whether the truck was actually following her or just happened to be going the same direction. She slowed down from 75 to 60 miles per hour. The pickup slowed down too, maintaining the same gap. She sped up to 80. The pickup matched her speed perfectly. That's when Elena started to get nervous. She'd heard stories from other female truckers about being stalked or harassed on isolated highways. The trucking industry had been working to address these issues, but it was still a real danger that every woman in the business had to consider. Elena tried changing lanes, moving from the right lane to the left and back again. The pickup followed her every move, sometimes switching lanes even before Elena had finished her own lane change, as if the driver was anticipating her actions. After an hour of this cat-and-mouse game, Elena decided to try losing her pursuer. There was a rest area coming up in about 5 miles, and Elena planned to pull in and wait for the pickup to continue down the highway. If the driver was just coincidentally going the same direction, he would drive on past. If he was actually following her, he would either pull in behind her or wait somewhere nearby. But when Elena put on her turn signal to exit for the rest area, something happened that made her blood run cold. The pickup truck flashed its headlights 3 times, honked its horn twice, and accelerated past her at high speed. As it passed, Elena got her first clear look at the driver. He was a middle-aged man with long, greasy hair and what looked like several days' worth of beard stubble. But it was his eyes that Elena would never forget. Even through the 2 layers of glass separating them, she could see a kind of intense, predatory focus that made her skin crawl. The man was staring directly at her with an expression that was equal parts hunger and hatred. As the pickup drove past, Elena could see that the back window had something written on it in what looked like white paint or correction fluid. The message was crude but unmistakable. "I'm watching you." Elena's heart started racing. She immediately grabbed her CB radio and put out a call for any other truckers in the area. "Breaker 19, this is Lone Star Elena on Highway 285 eastbound. I've got a situation here and could use some backup if anyone's in the area." The response was immediate. A driver named Big Mike came back on the radio from about 10 miles ahead. "Elena, this is Big Mike. I'm in a blue Peterbilt about 8 miles east of your position. What's your situation, darlin'?" Elena quickly explained about the pickup truck that had been following her and the threatening message in the rear window. Big Mike's response sent a chill down her spine. "Elena, I think I just passed that truck you're talking about. Red pickup, older model? He's pulled over on the shoulder about 3 miles ahead of you. Looks like he's waiting for something." Elena's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't a coincidence or a case of road rage. This man was actively hunting her, setting up an ambush further down the highway. She asked Big Mike to stay on the radio and keep her informed of the pickup's location. "He's moving again, Elena. Just pulled back onto the highway and he's doing about 90. Looks like he's trying to get ahead of you again." Elena made a decision that probably saved her life. Instead of continuing east on 285, she took the next available exit, a small farm road that headed north into even more desolate country. It wasn't the direction she needed to go for her delivery, but it would get her away from the main highway and hopefully away from her stalker. For about 20 minutes, Elena thought she'd escaped. The farm road was narrow and winding, passing through small ranches and oil fields. She saw a few other vehicles, mostly ranch trucks and service vehicles, but no sign of the red pickup. Then she crested a small hill and her heart nearly stopped. The red pickup was parked sideways across the road, completely blocking her path. The driver was standing outside the truck, and Elena could see that he was holding something in his hands, something that looked like a rifle. Elena slammed on her brakes, bringing her 18-wheeler to a stop about 100 yards from the roadblock. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her CB radio. Big Mike, I need you to call 911 right now. The guy in the pickup has set up a roadblock and he's got a weapon. Big Mike's voice came back immediately. Elena, I'm already on the phone with the state police. They've got units heading your way, but you need to get out of there now. Can you turn around? Elena looked in her mirrors. The narrow farm road didn't have enough space for her to turn around an 18-wheeler, and backing up would be slow and dangerous. She was trapped between the armed man ahead of her and the limited options behind her. The man with the rifle started walking toward her truck, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew his victim had nowhere to run. Elena could see his face more clearly now, and what she saw terrified her more than the weapon he was carrying. He was smiling. Then Elena remembered something from her truck driving school. In extreme emergency situations, a fully loaded 18-wheeler could be used as a battering ram. It wasn't something anyone would recommend under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. Elena put her truck in gear and floored the accelerator. The diesel engine roared to life, and 40 tons of truck and cargo began moving toward the roadblock. The man with the rifle suddenly realized what was happening and dove to one side, barely avoiding being run down. Elena's truck smashed into the pickup with tremendous force, pushing it off the road and into a drainage ditch. She didn't stop to assess the damage. She kept her foot on the accelerator and continued down the farm road, her truck's front end damaged but still functional. Behind her, she could see the man in her mirrors, standing in the middle of the road and gesturing angrily. But he was no longer a threat. His vehicle was destroyed, and she was putting distance between them with every second. 20 minutes later, Elena encountered the first state police cruiser racing toward the scene. She flagged them down and gave them the exact location of her attacker. Within an hour, the man was in custody, and Elena learned some disturbing details about who had been stalking her. The man's name was Dale Morrison, and he had a long criminal history including multiple charges for stalking, harassment, and assault. According to the police, Morrison had been targeting female truck drivers for over 2 years, using the isolated highways of West Texas as his hunting ground. Elena was the first driver who had managed to escape and fight back. During the investigation, police found detailed notes in Morrison's truck documenting the routes and schedules of dozens of female truckers. He had been following drivers for weeks at a time, learning their patterns and looking for opportunities to isolate them in remote areas. Elena's encounter with him had prevented what could have been a series of much more serious crimes. Morrison was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison on multiple charges including stalking, terroristic threatening, and attempted kidnapping. But the experience left Elena forever changed. She installed additional safety equipment in her truck, including dash cameras and a GPS panic button that would alert authorities to her exact location in case of emergency. Elena also became an advocate for trucker safety, particularly for women in the industry. She began speaking at truck driving schools and industry events, sharing her story and teaching other drivers how to recognize and respond to similar threats. But late at night, when Elena is driving through remote areas similar to that West Texas farm road, she still finds herself checking her mirrors more frequently than she used to, because she learned that the most dangerous predators aren't always supernatural creatures or legendary monsters. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing you can encounter on a dark highway is another human being who has chosen to embrace their darkest impulses. The desert highways of America can hide many secrets, and not all of them are supernatural. Sometimes the real horror comes from the realization that monsters walk among us, wearing human faces and driving ordinary vehicles. Danny Murphy had been driving the same route from Chicago to Denver for 7 years. Highway 80 west through Iowa and Nebraska, then south on Highway 76 through Colorado. It was a routine run, 2 days each way, with a regular stop at a truck stop called Prairie Junction about 50 miles east of North Platte, Nebraska. Prairie Junction wasn't the fanciest truck stop Danny had ever seen, but it had everything a driver needed. Clean restrooms, hot food, diesel fuel, and a small convenience store stocked with the essentials. The staff was friendly, the coffee was decent, and the parking lot was big enough to accommodate even the longest rigs. Danny had stopped there at least 100 times over the years. But in October 2020, Danny experienced something at Prairie Junction that defied every rational explanation he could think of. It was a cold Tuesday night, and Danny was running about 2 hours behind schedule due to construction delays in Iowa. He'd been driving for 10 hours straight and was looking forward to his usual stop at Prairie Junction for dinner and a short break before pushing on to Denver. As Danny approached the familiar exit, he was surprised to see that the truck stop sign wasn't lit up as usual. The large neon sign that normally announced Prairie Junction Truck Stop, Food Fuel Parking, was completely dark. Danny figured they were probably having electrical problems, something that wasn't uncommon at rural truck stops. But when Danny pulled into the parking lot, he immediately knew something was very wrong. The entire truck stop was dark. Not just the sign, but every light in the building, the fuel island lighting, even the security lights in the parking lot. The place looked completely abandoned. Danny parked his truck and walked toward the building, using his cell phone's flashlight to illuminate the path. As he got closer, he could see that the windows were boarded up with plywood, and there were weeds growing up through cracks in the pavement that he was certain hadn't been there just 3 weeks earlier on his last trip through. Most disturbing of all, there was a large sign posted on the front door that read, "Prairie Junction Truck Stop, closed permanently, building condemned. No trespassing by order of Hamilton County Sheriff's Department." Danny stared at the sign in disbelief. The date on the condemnation notice was from 2018, more than 2 years ago. But that was impossible. Danny had stopped here just 3 weeks earlier. He'd bought fuel, eaten dinner, and talked to Martha, the night shift cashier who'd been working there for over 15 years. Danny called the number on the sign, reaching the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher confirmed that Prairie Junction had been closed for health code violations in 2018 and had been condemned due to structural problems discovered during the inspection. "But I was just here 3 weeks ago," Danny insisted. "I bought fuel and food. There were other truckers here." The dispatcher was polite but firm. "Sir, that truck stop has been closed for over 2 years. There's no electricity, no running water, and the building is structurally unsafe. You must be thinking of a different location." Danny ended the call and stood in the dark parking lot, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. He pulled out his credit card statements on his phone and scrolled back to his last trip through Nebraska. There it was, a charge from Prairie Junction dated 3 weeks earlier for fuel and food, totaling $47.32. But according to the county, the truck stop had been closed for 2 years before that transaction ever took place. Danny decided to investigate further. He walked around the perimeter of the building, looking for any signs that it had been recently occupied. What he found only deepened the mystery. The fuel pumps were not only disconnected, but they were so corroded that they looked like they'd been sitting and used for years. The pavement around them was cracked and broken, with weeds and small bushes growing through the gaps. The dumpsters behind the building were empty and rusted through, clearly having been exposed to the elements for far longer than 3 weeks. Even the parking lot striping had faded to the point where the spaces were barely visible. Everything Danny was seeing suggested that the truck stop had indeed been abandoned for years. But he had clear memories of being here recently, and he had the credit card charges to prove it. Danny called his dispatcher to report the situation and ask if there might be another truck stop in the area with a similar name. His dispatcher checked the company's route database and confirmed that Prairie Junction was the only truck stop within 50 miles of Danny's current location. "Danny, are you feeling okay?" his dispatcher asked. "Maybe you should find another place to stop for the night and get some rest. You've been pushing pretty hard lately." Danny was about to agree when he noticed something that made his skin crawl. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see tire tracks in the dust-covered parking lot. Fresh tire tracks that looked like they'd been made by an 18-wheeler, leading directly to the spot where Danny always parked when he stopped at Prairie Junction. The tracks were too fresh to have been made years ago, but they were the only sign of recent activity in the entire abandoned facility. Danny followed the tire tracks with his flashlight, and they led him to a section of the parking lot where he made a discovery that nearly made his knees buckle. Scratched into the concrete, barely visible under years of accumulated dirt and debris, were the words "Martha was here." Martha, the same name as the night shift cashier Danny remembered talking to just 3 weeks earlier. With shaking hands, Danny called the sheriff's department again, this time asking to speak to someone who had been involved in the original investigation of Prairie Junction. After being transferred several times, he finally reached Deputy Stevens, who had been one of the officers who had handled the closure. "Prairie Junction," Deputy Stevens said thoughtfully. "Yeah, I remember that place. Sad story, actually. The owner, a woman named Martha Collins, had been trying to keep it running by herself after her husband died, but she couldn't keep up with the health and safety requirements. The place was falling apart." Danny's blood turned cold. What happened to Martha Collins? "Well, that's the tragic part," Deputy Stevens continued. "About 6 months after we closed the place down, Martha was found dead in her apartment. Apparently, she'd been struggling with depression after losing the business. The coroner ruled it a suicide." Danny barely managed to ask his next question. "When did Martha Collins die?" "Let me check the file," Deputy Stevens said. After a moment, he came back on the line. "Martha Collins died in March of 2019, about a year after the truck stop was closed." Danny ended the call and stood in the abandoned parking lot, trying to process what he'd just learned. The woman he remembered talking to 3 weeks ago had been dead for over a year before that conversation supposedly took place. But the credit card charges were real. Danny could see them clearly on his phone. $47.32 charged to Prairie Junction on the exact date he remembered stopping there. Danny called his credit card company and spoke to a fraud specialist, asking them to investigate the charges. After putting him on hold for several minutes, the specialist came back with information that only deepened the mystery. "Mr. Murphy, those charges you're asking about show up in our system, but when we try to trace them back to the merchant, we get an error message. It's like the business exists in our database, but not in reality. I've never seen anything quite like it." Danny spent another hour at the abandoned truck stop, taking photos and trying to find some rational explanation for what he was experiencing. But every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. He had somehow been interacting with a business and a person that had ceased to exist years earlier. When Danny finally got back on the road, he was shaken but determined to complete his delivery. But the experience changed him in ways he's still trying to understand. He's never stopped at Prairie Junction again, of course, because it doesn't exist anymore. But other truck stops along his route have started to feel different, less solid somehow, as if they might vanish at any moment. Danny has heard similar stories from other drivers since then. Truck stops that appear and disappear, gas stations that exist only at certain times of day, restaurants where the staff seems to be from a different era entirely. The trucking community has begun to quietly document these encounters, creating an unofficial database of locations where the normal rules of time and space seem to break down. Some drivers believe these experiences are caused by exhaustion and stress, hallucinations brought on by too many hours on the road. Others think there are thin places in reality, locations where different time periods overlap and intersect. Danny doesn't know what to believe anymore. All he knows is that somewhere in Nebraska, there's a truck stop that continues to serve customers even though it ceased to exist years ago. And sometimes, late at night when he's driving through similar remote areas, Danny finds himself looking for other places that might exist in that strange space between reality and memory, where the living and the dead continue to serve coffee and diesel fuel to travelers who may not realize they've crossed over into something far stranger than any highway they've ever driven. Robert Chun had been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years, and he thought he'd seen every possible variation of highway weirdness that America had to offer. But nothing in his 2 decades of experience prepared him for what he encountered on Interstate 57 in southern Illinois during the winter of 2019. Robert was hauling a load of electronics from Memphis to Chicago, running about 3 hours behind schedule due to an ice storm that had swept through the Ohio Valley. It was just after midnight, and the highway was treacherous with black ice and freezing rain. Visibility was so poor that Robert had slowed down to 45 miles per hour, using his hazard lights to warn other drivers of the dangerous conditions. He was about 30 miles north of Effingham when he first saw the convoy in his mirrors. For 18-wheelers running in perfect formation, maintaining exact spacing between each truck. At first, Robert was impressed by their coordination. It took skill and experience to maintain that kind of formation in good weather, let alone in the middle of an ice storm. But as the convoy got closer, Robert began to notice things that didn't make sense. For one thing, all 4 trucks appeared to be identical. Same make, same model, same color scheme. That wasn't unusual for a fleet operation, but what was unusual was how perfectly they were maintained. In the middle of a winter ice storm, all 4 trucks looked like they just rolled out of a car wash. No road salt, no ice buildup, no weather damage at all. The lead truck pulled alongside Robert in the left lane, and the driver waved at him through the passenger window. Robert waved back, a common courtesy among truckers. But when Robert got a closer look at the driver, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The man behind the wheel was wearing what looked like a 1970s style uniform, complete with a peaked cap and a patch on his shirt that Robert couldn't quite make out. His face was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light, and he was smiling in a way that seemed forced and unnatural. The convoy maintained formation alongside Robert for several miles, all 4 trucks matching his speed perfectly. Occasionally, one of the other drivers would wave or flash their lights, but Robert never got a clear look at any of them. They seemed to exist just at the edge of his vision, always slightly out of focus. Then Robert noticed something that made his blood run cold. The trucks in the convoy weren't leaving tracks in the snow and slush on the highway. Robert's own truck was kicking up spray and leaving clear tire marks in the winter mix, but the 4 trucks running alongside him were moving across the pavement as if they were floating just above the surface. Robert grabbed his CB radio and tried to make contact with the convoy. "Breaker 19, this is eastbound Robert on I-57. You got a copy on me, convoy?" The response came immediately, but it wasn't what Robert expected. Instead of the usual trucker chatter, he heard what sounded like music from the 1970s, mixed with voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The transmission was clear, but the content made no sense. "Convoy, convoy, you got a copy?" Robert tried again. This time, the lead truck's driver responded, but his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, despite the fact that the truck was less than 20 feet from Robert's cab. Roger that, good buddy. This is Phantom Leader. We're running a special delivery tonight. Thanks for the escort. Escort? Robert hadn't agreed to escort anyone. He was just trying to get his own load to Chicago safely. Phantom Leader, what kind of special delivery are you running? The response sent chills down Robert's spine. We're taking the boys home, good buddy. Been a long time since they've seen their families. Before Robert could ask what that meant, the convoy began to accelerate. All 4 trucks increased speed simultaneously, pulling ahead of Robert with an acceleration that seemed impossible given the icy conditions. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the darkness ahead, their taillights fading like distant stars. Robert increased his own speed slightly, trying to catch up with the convoy, but they seemed to be moving much faster than their brake lights had suggested. After 20 minutes of pushing his truck harder than was safe in the icy conditions, Robert still couldn't see any sign of the 4 trucks. That's when Robert saw the accident. About 10 miles north of where he'd last seen the convoy, Robert came upon a massive pileup involving multiple 18-wheelers. State police and emergency vehicles were already on scene, their flashing lights turning the ice-covered highway into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Robert pulled over and approached one of the state troopers, offering to help in any way he could. The trooper, whose nameplate read Officer Martinez, looked exhausted and grim. "Hell of a thing," Officer Martinez said, gesturing toward the wreckage. "4 trucks, all from the same company, all running in convoy. Looks like they hit black ice and jackknifed simultaneously. Never seen anything quite like it." Robert felt his heart start to race. 4 trucks? What company? Officer Martinez checked his notepad. Phantom Freight Lines. Ever heard of them? Robert shook his head, but something about the name triggered a memory. Phantom Leader. That's what the convoy driver had called himself on the radio. "When did this happen?" Robert asked. "That's the strange part," Officer Martinez replied. "According to our initial investigation, this accident happened about 40 years ago, December 15th, 1979. 4 drivers from Phantom Freight Lines died when their convoy hit black ice in this exact spot." Robert stared at the officer in disbelief. "But I just saw them. 20 minutes ago, they were running alongside me. I talked to them on the radio." Officer Martinez gave Robert a look that was part concern, part skepticism. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Maybe the driving conditions are getting to you. You should consider stopping for the night." But Robert was already walking toward the accident scene, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. As he got closer to the wreckage, he could see that the trucks were old, much older than he'd initially realized. They were 1970s-era tractors, models that hadn't been manufactured in decades. And then Robert saw something that nearly made him collapse. On the side of the lead truck, barely visible under 40 years of corrosion and weather damage, was a patch identical to the one he'd seen on the driver's uniform. A company logo for Phantom Freight Lines, with the words "Special Delivery Service" underneath. Officer Martinez had followed Robert to the wreckage. The weird thing about this accident is that it keeps getting reported. Every few years, usually during bad weather, we get calls from drivers who claim they've seen this convoy running the highway. Same formation, same trucks, same route. Robert looked at the mangled remains of the 4 trucks, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with his crystal-clear memory of the perfectly maintained convoy that had run alongside him just 30 minutes earlier. According to the old police reports, Officer Martinez continued, the 4 drivers were all Vietnam veterans who had started the trucking company together after they came home from the war. They were hauling Christmas presents for a charity drive when the accident happened. Toys for underprivileged kids in Chicago. Robert walked around to the back of the lead trailer, and his breath caught in his throat. Despite 4 decades of exposure to the elements, He could still make out boxes and packages scattered throughout the trailer. Christmas wrapping paper, faded but still recognizable, clung to some of the packages. "They never made their delivery," Robert said quietly. Officer Martinez nodded. Every December, right around the anniversary of the accident, drivers report seeing the convoy. Always during bad weather, always running north toward Chicago. The theory is that they're still trying to complete their final run, still trying to get those Christmas presents to the kids who were waiting for them. As Robert stood there in the freezing rain, looking at the ghostly remains of the convoy he'd just encountered, he felt a profound sadness. These men had died trying to do something good, trying to bring joy to children during the Christmas season. And somehow, their dedication had been strong enough to transcend death itself. Robert returned to his truck with a new perspective on his own work. The highways of America weren't just roads for commerce and transportation. They were pathways for dreams, for hopes, for the unfinished business of those who had given their lives in service to others. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when weather conditions are at their worst, those dreams take physical form and run the highways one more time, still trying to complete deliveries that were interrupted by tragedy decades ago. Robert never saw the Phantom Convoy again, but every December 15th, he makes sure to drive extra carefully on Interstate 57 in Illinois, because he knows that somewhere out there, for determined truckers are still running their route, still trying to deliver Christmas joy to children who have long since grown up and had children of their own. The highway remembers everything, and some deliveries are too important to let death interfere with their completion. Lisa Kowalski grew up in northern Minnesota, where the winters are long and brutal, and the forests stretch for hundreds of miles without a single town or gas station. She'd heard the old stories from her Polish grandmother about creatures that stalked the woods during the harshest months. Things that had once been human but had given in to an unspeakable hunger that transformed them into something monstrous. But Lisa had always assumed those were just stories, folklore meant to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. She never imagined she'd encounter one of these creatures during a routine freight delivery in February 2021. Lisa was hauling a load of medical supplies from Minneapolis to Grand Portage, taking Highway 2 along the north shore of Lake Superior. It was one of the most beautiful drives in America during the summer, but in the middle of February, it was a frozen hellscape of ice, snow, and temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours. The blizzard had started just after she left Duluth, and within an hour, visibility had dropped to almost zero. Lisa was crawling along at 25 miles per hour, using the roadside reflectors as her only guide through the whiteout conditions. She'd been driving for 6 hours straight and was looking for a place to pull over and wait out the storm. That's when she saw the figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, Lisa thought it might be a stranded motorist. The figure was tall and appeared to be wearing dark clothing, standing perfectly still despite the howling wind and driving snow. Lisa slowed down and hit her horn, expecting the person to move out of the way. But the figure didn't budge. As Lisa got closer, she could see that something was very wrong with what she was looking at. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, much taller than any normal person. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its proportions seemed off in ways that Lisa's brain couldn't quite process. Lisa brought her truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from the figure and rolled down her window, shouting over the wind, "Hey, you need help? You can't stand in the middle of the road." The figure slowly turned toward her truck, and Lisa got her first clear look at its face. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water. The creature's face was gaunt and skeletal, with skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. Its eyes were sunken deep into its skull and seemed to glow with their own pale light. But most terrifying of all was its mouth, which hung open to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth that looked more like fangs than anything human. The creature began walking toward Lisa's truck with a strange, shambling gait. Its movements were awkward and jerky, like a marionette being controlled by someone who didn't quite know how to work the strings. But despite its ungainly movement, it was covering ground quickly, much faster than seemed possible. Lisa threw her truck into reverse and began backing up as fast as she dared in the blizzard conditions. But when she looked in her mirrors, she saw something that nearly made her lose control of the vehicle. The creature was no longer walking. It was running on all fours like an animal, its long arms and legs propelling it across the snow-covered pavement with inhuman speed. Lisa spun the steering wheel and managed to turn her truck around, grinding gears as she shifted into drive and floored the accelerator. Her truck's powerful diesel engine roared to life, but even at 60 miles per hour, she could still see the creature gaining on her in her side mirrors. The thing that was chasing her moved like nothing Lisa had ever seen. It would run on its hind legs for several strides, then drop to all fours and bound forward like a wolf. Sometimes it seemed to leap impossible distances, clearing obstacles that should have stopped it cold. Lisa grabbed her CB radio, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the microphone. "Mayday, mayday, this is northbound Lisa on Highway 2. I'm being chased by something, and I need help. Anyone out there? Please respond." The only response was static, mixed with what sounded like distant howling. Lisa tried again, but the radio seemed to be picking up nothing but wind noise and strange, inhuman sounds that made her skin crawl. For 20 terrifying minutes, Lisa raced through the blizzard with the creature pursuing her truck. Sometimes it would fall behind and disappear from her mirrors, only to reappear moments later running alongside her truck in the ditch or even on the opposite side of the highway. The most frightening moment came when the creature somehow got ahead of her truck and appeared in her headlights, running backward while facing her vehicle. Its mouth was open wide, and Lisa could hear it making sounds that were part human scream, part animal howl. The sounds penetrated the cab of her truck despite the closed windows and the noise of the diesel engine. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chase ended. Lisa crested a small hill and found herself entering the outskirts of Grand Marais, a small town on the shores of Lake Superior. The moment her headlights illuminated the first buildings, the creature veered off the highway and disappeared into the forest. Lisa didn't stop in Grand Marais. She kept driving until she reached Grand Portage, where she delivered her load and immediately called the police. The officer who took her report was professional but clearly skeptical of her story. He suggested that she might have encountered a large dog or possibly a black bear, and that the blizzard conditions had made it appear more threatening than it actually was. But Lisa knew what she had seen, and it wasn't any ordinary animal. When she returned home to Minneapolis, she began researching the folklore of northern Minnesota, looking for anything that might explain her encounter. That's when she learned about the Wendigo, a creature from Native American legend that was said to inhabit the forests of the Great Lakes region. According to the stories, Wendigos were once human beings who had resorted to cannibalism during times of extreme hardship. The act of eating human flesh transformed them into monsters, creatures with an insatiable hunger for more human meat. Wendigos were described as being extremely tall and gaunt, with yellowed fangs, glowing eyes, and an ability to move through the forest with supernatural speed. They were said to be most active during the coldest months of winter, when food was scarce and people were most vulnerable. Lisa also discovered that her encounter wasn't unique. Online forums and social media groups dedicated to paranormal experiences contained dozens of reports from drivers who claimed to have encountered similar creatures on the remote highways of northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, skeletal figures with inhuman speed and an aggressive behavior toward vehicles. Some researchers theorized that these sightings were actually encounters with Bigfoot or similar cryptid creatures. Others suggested that the harsh winter conditions and isolation of the northern forests created ideal circumstances for mass hallucinations or misidentification of known animals. But Lisa found one theory particularly compelling. A folklorist at the University of Minnesota had proposed that Wendigo sightings might be connected to unsolved disappearances in the region. Every year, several people went missing in the vast forests of northern Minnesota, and their bodies were never found. The researcher suggested that some of these missing persons might have survived by resorting to cannibalism, potentially triggering the psychological and physical transformation described in Wendigo legends. Whether the creature Lisa encountered was supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, the experience changed her forever. She still drives the northern routes, but she's installed additional safety equipment in her truck, including a satellite communication system that works even in the most remote areas, and she's made sure never to drive Highway 2 alone during a blizzard again, because she knows that somewhere in the vast forests of northern Minnesota, something is waiting for stranded travelers, something that was once human but has become something far hungrier and far more dangerous. The Wendigo doesn't just hunt for food. It hunts for the opportunity to create others like itself, spreading its curse to anyone desperate enough to do whatever it takes to survive. And in the endless winter nights of Minnesota's wilderness, survival sometimes demands choices that transform us into monsters. Miguel Santos had been driving trucks for 12 years, but he'd never taken a load down Route 491 in New Mexico, the highway that locals still called by its old designation, Route 666. Miguel had heard the stories about the highway's dark reputation, but he'd always assumed they were just trucker folklore, tall tales designed to spook rookies. But in March 2020, Miguel's dispatcher assigned him a rush delivery that would take him straight down the infamous highway, hauling a load of construction equipment from Denver to Gallup, New Mexico. Miguel had no choice but to take the route, even though every experienced driver he talked to warned him to be careful on 666. There's something wrong with that highway, an older driver named Pete had told him. Things happen there that don't happen anywhere else. You see things that aren't really there, or maybe you see things that are too real for comfort. Miguel had laughed off the warnings, but as he drove south through Colorado and entered New Mexico, he began to understand why Route 666 had such a dark reputation. The landscape along the highway was desolate and otherworldly, with strange rock formations and vast stretches of empty desert that seemed to go on forever. It was just after sunset when Miguel first noticed them. Dark shapes moving in his peripheral vision, always just outside the direct beam of his headlights. At first, he thought they might be tumbleweeds or small animals, but the shapes moved with too much purpose, too much intelligence. As full darkness fell, the shapes became more distinct. They looked like human figures, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Miguel would catch glimpses of them standing beside the highway or moving through the desert parallel to his truck. But whenever he looked directly at them, they would vanish. Miguel tried to convince himself that he was seeing optical illusions caused by fatigue and the strange lighting conditions of the desert. But as the night wore on, the shadow figures became more numerous and more aggressive in their behavior. They began appearing directly in front of his truck, forcing Miguel to swerve or brake to avoid hitting them. But whenever Miguel's headlights swept across the area where a figure had been standing, there was nothing there. No body, no debris, no evidence that anything had ever been in the road. Around midnight, Miguel stopped at a small gas station in Shiprock, New Mexico, hoping to get some coffee and shake off the unease that had been building all evening. The station was run by an elderly Navajo man who looked at Miguel with knowing eyes when he described what he'd been seeing. "Shadow people," the man said simply. "They've always been on this highway. My grandfather used to say they were spirits of people who died with unfinished business, trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead." Miguel asked if there was anything he could do to protect himself or make them go away. The old man shook his head sadly. They're drawn to travelers, especially at night. They want what you have, your life force, your connection to the living world. Best thing you can do is keep moving, don't stop for anything, and whatever you do, don't let them get inside your truck. Miguel bought his coffee and got back on the road, but the old man's words echoed in his mind. Don't let them get inside your truck. What did that mean? How could shadow figures get inside a moving vehicle? He got his answer about 30 miles south of Shiprock. Miguel was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when he heard a soft tapping sound coming from the sleeper berth behind his seat. At first, he thought it might be something shifting in his cargo, but the sound had a deliberate rhythm to it, like someone gently knocking on a door. Miguel pulled over and turned on his interior lights to investigate. The sleeper berth was empty, exactly as he'd left it. But the tapping continued, and now it seemed to be coming from multiple locations around the cab. Tap, tap, tap from the passenger door. Tap, tap, tap from the roof. Tap, tap, tap from underneath the truck. The sounds were soft but insistent, like someone asking permission to come inside. Miguel grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck to look around. The highway was completely empty in both directions, and the desert stretched away into darkness on all sides. But the tapping sounds continued, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. That's when Miguel saw them clearly for the first time. The shadow people weren't just dark shapes moving in the distance. They were surrounding his truck, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. They were human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their faces were indistinct, like smudged photographs, but Miguel could sense that they were watching him with intense interest. One of the shadow figures began to move closer, and Miguel could see that it wasn't walking so much as gliding across the ground. As it approached, the temperature around Miguel's truck began to drop noticeably, and his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Miguel scrambled back into his truck and locked the doors, though he realized that physical barriers probably wouldn't stop beings that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. The tapping sounds resumed immediately, now coming from all around the cab with increasing intensity. But it was what Miguel heard next that nearly broke his sanity. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in whispers so soft they were barely audible. They were coming through the truck's ventilation system, through the radio, through the very metal of the cab itself. The voices were speaking in different languages, but Miguel could understand them all somehow. They were pleading, begging, demanding. "Let us in," they whispered. "We're so cold out here. We've been waiting so long. Just open the door. Just for a moment." Miguel started his engine and put the truck in gear, but as he began to move, the shadow people moved with him. They flowed alongside his truck like a dark tide, keeping pace no matter how fast he drove. Some of them seemed to be trying to climb onto the trailer, their elongated fingers scraping against the metal sides. The voices grew more insistent. "We know you can hear us, Miguel. We know you can see us. We've been watching you your whole life, waiting for this moment. You belong with us now." How did they know his name? Miguel had never told anyone his name on this highway, hadn't spoken to anyone except the gas station attendant. But somehow, these entities knew exactly who he was. Miguel pushed his truck to dangerous speeds, racing through the darkness with the shadow people flowing around him like smoke. The voices continued their whispered assault, and occasionally Miguel would see faces pressed against his windows. Faces that looked almost human, but with eyes that were pools of absolute darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Miguel saw lights ahead. The town of Gallup was finally visible on the horizon, and as he approached the first streetlights, the shadow people began to fall away from his truck. One by one, they faded back into the darkness, their whispered voices growing fainter until they were indistinguishable from the wind. By the time Miguel reached the truck stop on the outskirts of Gallup, the shadow people had vanished completely. Miguel parked his truck and sat in the cab for a long time, his hands shaking as the adrenaline slowly left his system. The bright lights of the truck stop seemed almost supernaturally welcoming after his encounter with the creatures of Route 666. He completed his delivery the next morning and immediately requested a different route back to Denver. Miguel never drove Route 666 again, but he researched the highway's history when he got home, hoping to find some explanation for what he'd experienced. What he found was disturbing. Route 666 had been renamed Route 491 in 2003 specifically because of its association with supernatural phenomena and unexplained accidents. The highway had one of the highest accident rates in the country, with many crashes occurring under mysterious circumstances. Local Native American tribes had long considered the area to be cursed, a place where the barriers between the physical and spirit worlds were dangerously thin. Archaeological evidence suggested that the highway passed through several ancient burial grounds, and some researchers theorized that the road construction had disturbed spiritual forces that had been dormant for centuries. Miguel also found dozens of reports from other drivers who had encountered the shadow people. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, dark figures that moved with unnatural grace, voices that whispered through closed windows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by malevolent intelligence. Some drivers reported that the shadow people had followed them home, appearing in their mirrors for weeks after traveling Route 666. Others claimed that the entities had somehow attached themselves to their trucks, causing mechanical problems and strange accidents on completely different highways. Miguel never experienced any follow-up encounters, but he installed protective charms in his truck based on advice from Native American spiritual advisors. He also made sure to carry sage and other cleansing materials whenever he drove through areas with similar reputations. Because Miguel learned that some highways in America are more than just roads. They're pathways that connect our world to places that exist in shadow and whisper, places where entities that were never human wait patiently for travelers who venture too far into the darkness. And once you've seen them, once you've heard their voices calling your name through the night, you carry a piece of that darkness with you forever. The shadow people don't just haunt highways. They haunt the memories of everyone who's encountered them, leaving travelers forever changed by the knowledge that we share this world with things that exist just beyond the edge of human understanding. Carmen Rodriguez had been driving trucks for 18 years when she decided to take one last run before retiring. At 58, she'd seen enough of America's highways to fill several lifetimes, and she was ready to settle down with her grandchildren in Phoenix. But her dispatcher had one final load for her, a rush delivery that would take her from Portland, Oregon to Miami, Florida, driving straight through the heart of the American night. Carmen accepted the job, thinking it would be a fitting end to her career. One last cross-country haul, one final chance to see the America she devoted her life to serving. She had no idea that this journey would become the most terrifying experience of her life, a trip that would combine elements of every horror story she'd ever heard from other drivers. The load was unusual, medical equipment being transported to a research facility in Miami. The cargo was valuable and time-sensitive, requiring Carmen to maintain a tight schedule with minimal stops. She left Portland on a Tuesday evening, planning to arrive in Miami by Friday afternoon. For the first 2 days, the trip proceeded normally. Carmen made good time through Oregon and California, crossed into Arizona without incident, and was feeling confident about making her delivery on schedule. But as she entered New Mexico on Thursday night, things began to go wrong in ways that defied explanation. It started with her radio picking up transmissions that shouldn't have been possible. As Carmen drove through the desert near Tucumcari, Her CB radio began receiving clear conversations between truckers who claimed to be driving on highways that had been decommissioned decades ago. She heard drivers reporting positions on Route 66, which had been bypassed by Interstate 40 in the 1980s. At first, Carmen thought she might be picking up old recordings or some kind of historical reenactment. But the conversations were too specific, too detailed, and they included references to current events and modern truck equipment. Then she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. It was Jake Morrison, the driver who had encountered the Bigfoot creature in Washington state. But according to the conversation Carmen was hearing, Jake was currently driving through Montana on a highway that Carmen knew had been closed for construction for the past 6 months. Carmen tried to respond to the transmissions, but her own voice seemed to be absorbed by some kind of interference before it could reach the airwaves. She could hear other drivers clearly, but they couldn't hear her. As the night progressed, Carmen began to recognize more voices from stories she'd heard around truck stops and on driver forums. There was Sarah Chun, who had picked up the phantom hitchhiker on Route 50. Tommy Yazzie, who had encountered the skinwalker in Arizona. Elena Rodriguez, who had been stalked by the highway predator in Texas. All of them were out there somewhere in the darkness, driving their trucks through a version of America that existed parallel to the one Carmen knew. And somehow, her radio was picking up their transmissions from across the supernatural divide. But the radio voices were just the beginning. As Carmen crossed into Texas, she began to see things that confirmed her worst fears about what was happening. In her mirrors, she could see other trucks running behind her, trucks that hadn't been there moments before. They would appear and disappear like mirages, sometimes running in formation, sometimes seeming to race alongside her at impossible speeds. Carmen recognized some of the trucks from the stories she'd heard. There was the red pickup that had stalked Elena Rodriguez, now somehow transformed into an 18-wheeler that paced Carmen's truck with predatory intent. There was what looked like the phantom convoy from Illinois, for identical trucks running in perfect formation despite the fact that their drivers had died decades ago. Most disturbing of all, Carmen began to see landscapes that she knew were impossible. As she drove through Texas, she caught glimpses of Washington state forests in her peripheral vision. The Nevada desert appeared outside her passenger window while she was driving through Louisiana swampland. It was as if all the haunted highways of America were converging into a single nightmarish road. Carmen's truck began to experience mechanical problems that made no sense. Her engine temperature would fluctuate wildly without any apparent cause. Her speedometer would show impossible readings, sometimes indicating that she was traveling at over 200 miles per hour while she felt like she was barely moving. Her GPS system showed her position as being in multiple states simultaneously. As dawn approached, Carmen found herself driving through what should have been Florida, but the landscape outside her windows looked more like the Pacific Northwest. Dense forests lined the highway, and she could see snow-capped mountains in the distance. According to her GPS, she was still on course for Miami, but everything she saw suggested otherwise. That's when Carmen realized what was happening to her. She was experiencing every horror story that had ever been reported by America's truck drivers, all compressed into a single, impossible journey. The highway she was traveling wasn't just a road through physical space. It was a route through the collective nightmares of everyone who had ever driven a big rig through the American night. Carmen's radio crackled to life with a familiar voice. It was Martha, the cashier from the Vanishing truck stop in Nebraska. "Carmen Rodriguez," the voice said, clear as day. "You're almost home now, honey. Just a few more miles to go." Carmen looked around frantically, trying to understand where she was. The road ahead stretched into infinity, lined with every type of terrain she'd ever driven through. Desert, forest, mountains, plains, all existing simultaneously in a landscape that followed no earthly geography. "I don't understand," Carmen said into her radio microphone. Where am I? What's happening to me? Martha's voice came back, warm and reassuring despite the impossible circumstances. You're on the final run, sweetheart. Every trucker takes it eventually. It's the road that connects all the stories, all the experiences, all the mysteries that drivers encounter out here in the darkness. Carmen saw other trucks appearing alongside her now, their drivers waving as they ran in convoy formation. She recognized some of them from truck stop conversations, drivers who had disappeared over the years, vanishing without a trace on remote highways. They all seemed happy, peaceful, as if they'd finally found what they'd been searching for during their years on the road. "Am I dead?" Carmen asked. Martha's voice carried a gentle laugh. "Death, life, they're just different ways of driving the same highway, honey. You've been carrying pieces of every story you ever heard, every mystery you ever encountered. Now you get to be part of the story yourself." As Carmen drove deeper into the impossible landscape, she began to understand. Every horror story told by America's truckers was connected, part of a vast network of supernatural experiences that crisscrossed the continent like an invisible web. The drivers who encountered these phenomena weren't just random victims. They were chroniclers, witnesses, guardians of mysteries that most people would never see. Carmen's truck began to slow down as she approached what looked like the largest truck stop she'd ever seen. The parking lot stretched to the horizon, filled with thousands of 18-wheelers from every era of American trucking. Drivers were walking between the trucks, sharing stories, comparing experiences, finally able to speak freely about the impossible things they'd witnessed. Carmen parked her truck and stepped out into the strange, timeless light of the supernatural truck stop. She was greeted by drivers she'd heard about in stories, drivers who had become legends in the trucking community. They welcomed her with the camaraderie that only fellow road warriors could understand. "Your delivery," Martha said, appearing beside Carmen with a clipboard in her hand. "The medical equipment for Miami." Carmen looked back at her trailer, confused. "But I never made it to Miami. I got lost somewhere between reality and nightmare." Martha smiled. "The delivery was never about the equipment, honey. It was about bringing you here to us. Every piece of cargo we carry is really just an excuse to keep driving, to keep witnessing, to keep adding to the great collection of stories that make America's highways more than just pavement and paint." Carmen looked around at the impossible truck stop, at the drivers who had found their way here from across the decades, and she understood. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She would continue driving, but now her routes would take her through dimensions of experience that living drivers could only glimpse in their darkest moments. Carmen Rodriguez completed her final run, but like all the best truckers, she never really stopped driving. She just found new highways to explore, highways that exist in the space between stories, where the real and the impossible meet at truck stops that serve coffee to the living and the dead alike. And sometimes, late at night, when living drivers are alone on America's most remote highways, they hear Carmen's voice on their CB radios, offering encouragement, sharing wisdom, and reminding them that every mile they drive adds to the great tapestry of stories that connect all travelers who have chosen to make the highway their home. So there you have it. 10 terrifying true stories from America's truck drivers. 10 encounters with the impossible that remind us that our highways are more than just routes between cities. They're pathways through mystery, corridors of the unexplained, and sometimes roads that lead us to places we never expected to go. From the Bigfoot encounter in the Olympic Peninsula to Carmen's final supernatural run, these stories show us that reality is far stranger and more complex than we usually allow ourselves to believe. The men and women who drive America's 18-wheelers don't just transport goods from place to place. They serve as witnesses to phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about the world we live in. Every night, as millions of Americans sleep safely in their beds, Thousands of truck drivers are out there navigating the darkness, encountering things that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. They see shadow people on cursed highways, phantom convoys still trying to complete decades-old deliveries, and creatures that science insists cannot exist. But perhaps the most frightening truth revealed by these stories is that the supernatural isn't confined to remote locations or abandoned buildings. It's out there on the highways we all travel, the same roads we use for family vacations and business trips. The only difference is that most of us pass through these haunted corridors during daylight hours, when the veil between our world and the other world is at its thickest. The truck drivers who shared these experiences with us have done more than just tell scary stories. They've pulled back the curtain on a hidden America, a country where the impossible happens every night and the only witnesses are the brave souls who choose to make their living on the highway. These stories also remind us that America itself is haunted, not just by the spirits of individual people, but by the collective experiences of everyone who has ever traveled these roads. Native American burial grounds, Civil War battlefields, sites of tragic accidents, places where dreams died and lives ended abruptly. All of this history layers upon itself, creating an invisible landscape of memory and trauma that sensitive individuals can sometimes perceive. If you've enjoyed these spine-chilling tales from America's highways, then you're going to love our next video exploring the 10 most haunted places in America. From ancient burial grounds that predate European settlement to modern buildings where tragedy has left an indelible mark, we'll take you on a journey through locations where the supernatural isn't just possible, it's practically guaranteed. You'll hear about the old hospital where patients still walk the halls decades after their deaths, the historic hotel where guests check in but never check out, and the abandoned prison where the screams of long-dead inmates still echo through empty cells. These are places where the veil between worlds has grown thin, where the past and present collide in ways that will challenge everything you believe about life, death, and what lies beyond. Click on the video that should be appearing on your screen right now to continue your journey into America's darkest mysteries. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we've got many more terrifying true stories coming your way. Sweet dreams, and remember, the next time you're driving alone at night on a lonely highway, you might not be as alone as you think. The road has memory, and some travelers never really reach their final destination. They just keep on driving, adding their own chapters to the endless story of America's haunted highways. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous curves are the ones you can't see coming.